college students screamed to prevent Heather MacDonald from giving a talk that said Blue Lives Matter.
Black lives, they matter here. Black lives, they matter here.
MacDonald is controversial because she writes about uncomfortable topics like race, a war on cops, and the diversity delusion. I've released short videos with MacDonald, but she has much more to say about things like discrimination, crime, feminism, and America's welfare state. So here's our full interview. You've written these horrible, say some, controversial things for years, been vilified, ignored. Now Donald Trump is president, and he's saying, yeah, these things are true, and I'm going to fix them.
Whether you are a doctor, an accountant, a lawyer, or an air traffic controller, you should be hired and promoted based on skill and competence, not race or gender.
I think he's going to liberate us. It is an extraordinary thing to have the man with the greatest bully pulpit in the world, really, saying, you can't scare me by calling me a racist. It is really hard to calculate what the effects of that are going to be long term, but it is going to make a difference. Because for far too long, the left, people who hate Western civilization, who hate American civilization, who hate the idea of excellence and merit, have been able to silence dissenters from their orthodoxy by calling them a racist. And you can say to Trump all you want, you're a racist for downsizing the federal bureaucracy. You're a racist for saying that science awards should be granted based on, get this, scientific knowledge and not race or gender. And he doesn't give a damn. He just keeps on doing it. So it's really, from that respect, it's an extraordinary moment to be living through.
Well, let's break some of that down. Hatred of Western civilization. What do you mean?
For the left to claim that the West is the source of inequity in the world, of inequity in history, of oppression, of systemic racism, of the crushing of minority voices, of indigenous populations, that is so ignorant. It is so blind to the reality of history. The fact of the matter is, there is not a single culture or a single civilization that has not tried to gain as much power and as much dominance over its neighbors as possible to the limits of its technological capacity.
But the West was powerful and did it, and did dominate.
Yes, because we had the technology to do it. It wasn't for lack of trying
but it's
on everybody else's
cruel and
part.
unfair.
Unfair up to a point. We also brought the rule of law. We brought science. We brought engineering to cultures that for millennia had lived with devastating disease, with devastating poverty, and in fact, really rather soon within the era of colonialism, the West began rethinking this entire project. It was England that put its treasury to bear on trying to end the transatlantic slave trade. They blockaded the coast of West Africa with their navy. They spent 13% of their naval resources to try to stop that trade. They occupied Lagos, Nigeria, to try to get them to stop trading in slaves. There's still slave trading going on in parts of the Arabic world. The ideas that the left uses to discredit the West are uniquely Western ideas. The West came up with the idea of rights. The West came up with the idea of equal rights, of tolerance, of freedom from religious domination. These are all Western ideas that now the left hurls back against us and say, well, you're not perfect in them. No, we're not, but no other civilization is as well.
You make the left sound like they controlled everything.
They pretty much did. They controlled the elite establishments. They have dominated universities. They've dominated the curriculum.
I think that white people are committed to being villains in the aggregate, right?
Silly people in universities, but they got power. How did they get power to change our world?
That's a good question. Why did people give in? And this is something I struggle with all the time, John, of what is it about Western civilization, uniquely about Western civilization, that subjects itself to this corrosive acid of unending critique. Critique
Well,
is
we're
good.
open to criticism.
Critique
That's part
is
of
very good. That's what made us the success we were, of Plato and Socrates saying an unquestioned life is not worth living. Consider your received assumptions. Are they correct? That is very good. Do not accept superstition. Do not accept authority. Now, here we're getting into some problems, because and as a libertarian, you're going to take a different stance on this.
I resist authority.
You resist all authority, and I would
Not
say
all authority, but
okay.
too
Well,
much
there's
authority.
your technique. Well, not all authority, certainly, and I would say, obviously there's a pendulum swing here, but it can go too far when you have people believing that they have the right to resist arrest, that they get to decide on the spot. What's legitimate authority or not, that can be too far. And that certainly parental authority is valid, and at some point, teachers' authority is valid. So we can go up the line of aging at how much do you question college authority? Right now, you have this weird blend where you have these college students that are acting out little psychodramas of oppression and rebellion, pretending that they're questioning authority when they're not. They're simply parroting the anti-colonial rhetoric that they're getting from their universities, and they're play acting being revolutionaries in their college quad.
But they won. They changed government. They changed
science.
corporations.
I know.
White people are all racist.
They canceled people.
At De Anza College, I was being accused of white speaking and white splaining and supporting white supremacy.
It is understandable that we have a guilty conscience when it comes to all issues related to race because of our
For good reason.
centuries-long betrayal of our founding ideals and not being willing to accord Black Americans the same rights as we proclaimed were inherent in all human beings.
So that's all they're saying. Remember that.
No, they're saying much more than that. That's right. We should remember it, and we do remember it. And believe me, there's not a single American textbook today that does not give vast amounts of attention to the abomination of slavery and to the courage of Black abolitionists, of Frederick Douglass, and the voices in the 20th century that were also fighting the still incomplete fight until the 1960s for legal equal rights. We are susceptible to that, but we have way overcorrected.
You say disparate impact is destroying America. Most people don't even know what it is.
It is a concept that was one of the greatest success stories of a civil rights bar that was running out of cases to prosecute and wanted to expand its jurisdiction indefinitely into the future and massively across society. The history of it, we had civil rights statutes that were passed in the 1960s, necessarily, belatedly, long overdue, that said, as employers, you may not discriminate against applicants based on the color of their skin. And you may disagree with those. You may think that that's
I do. I think
that's
it's your
the
business.
Right. You're right. Okay, but for now, we'll give that a pass and say, so you're going to be more radical than I am on this, that you couldn't intentionally discriminate. And that was seen as the way to dismantle America's long legacy of racism. Well, then it turned out that employers sort of got their act together and stopped discriminating as intentionally. So the courts and activists came up with a new definition of what would be illegal discrimination. And it gets rid of the idea of intention and intentional discrimination completely. Disparate impact is the conceit that if there's a standard that Blacks do more poorly at, it's discriminatory. So if you have a certain expectation of reading level or math skills, to qualify to be a teacher, to be a firefighter, to be a police officer, and an employer administers a test and blacks do more poorly on that, that's a racist test. Instead of meeting the standard, our response is to throw out the standard. And the employer is not racist. You don't have to show that the employer wants to discriminate against blacks. The employer just wants a qualified workforce. But if he has used some kind of standard that means that there are less blacks qualifying, that then becomes something that violates civil rights. I'll give you an example right out of the Biden administration.
Maryland State Police hoping to settle a U.S. Justice Department investigation into its alleged racial discrimination by paying almost $3 million.
The Maryland State Police wanted to make sure that the state troopers could read at a very basic level, because as a police officer, you're going to need to write police reports, you're going to need to understand the patrol guide, you're going to need some level of dealing with written language and being able to read and write, very minimal level. So the Maryland State Police had a written exam. And this is the type of question, 4 very simple paragraphs written at like maybe a 3rd grade level that discussed theft from libraries in the United States. And then followed up a true or false question. Is theft a problem in U.S. libraries? Just reading comprehension. Have you been able to understand this 4-paragraph passage? Well, this test, and the questions were all at that level of simplicity, had what's known as a disparate impact on black applicants to be Maryland State Troopers. Black applicants failed the test at higher rates than whites. The Maryland State Troopers didn't intend to exclude black state troopers. Racism had nothing to do with it. It was a colorblind, neutral test of skills. But because it had a disparate impact on black applicants and disqualified more black applicants, the Biden Justice Department brought a suit against the Maryland State Police for having a discriminatory test.
Hiring tests that unfairly and unlawfully excluded them from employment.
This is ridiculous. Taxpayers should not be on the hook for this. It was not a racist department. Disparate impact means that an institution can be completely colorblind. It can want to have as many different races as possible. But if it has a standard that it's colorblind, meritocratic, but that blacks do poorly on, you got to throw out the standard. And it's not just sort of public service jobs like policing. Our taxpayers in New York recently paid out $2 billion in damages because the exam for licensing teachers in New York State, which I can tell you went through decades of being dumbed down to proleptically avoid disparate impact. Blacks still didn't do as well on it. And so a court decided, even though you've spent decades throwing out every question on this exam that has too wide a racial divergence, you still didn't have the same proportion of black applicants passing as white applicants. We're going to throw out the exam, and you, New York taxpayers, are liable for $2 billion. Disparate impact is our greatest weapon against merit. It is the greatest weapon against excellence, and it is an abuse of the spirit of our civil rights laws, which was to say, we're going to allow everybody to reach their highest potential. We ban discrimination, but we do not ban excellence. We do not ban high expectations. We want all people to reach the same level of competence. We're not going to have 2 standards of achievement, one for a particular race, another for another race, one for a particular sex, another for a different sex. We are going to have a single level of excellence in this society, and that is how we're going to move forward.
There is a deliberate effort to hire more people from more diverse backgrounds to work as paramedics and EMTs.
You're also maybe putting people's lives at risk because, again, these are very simple skills that are being tested, but in an emergency situation, you want people that have the cognitive skills to make some envelope calculations or simply be able to read. We saw this in New Haven as well, a firefighter exam, where you're asking people, they need to be able to read instructions on hazardous chemicals so that you don't mix the wrong chemicals. This is not a racist demand. It is a colorblind, bare minimum demand for these types of jobs where public safety is at risk. But public safety is also at risk in medicine. There is a test for licensing doctors in medical schools called the medical licensing exam. And it's admitted in a series of stages. Step 1 of the medical licensing exam used to be graded. And so you would be able to see how students are doing on the curve. And those grades were used for a number of things, but for one thing, by hospitals to choose residents for the most competitive, highly demanding residencies, whether it's neurology or very complicated surgery. And because Black medical students were at the absolute bottom of the medical grading exam on step 1, the licensing board for physicians decided to throw out the scores and make the exam pass-fail so that hospitals and future employers have no way of evaluating whether this student is struggling to absorb basic medical facts or is succeeding marvelously and is likely has a good chance of becoming the next physician scientist that might give us a breakthrough in understanding Alzheimer's disease. This pressure on medical licensing is going to continue into step 2 of the medical licensing exam. You already have medical schools that have simply waived the medical college admissions tests for Black students because they do so poorly on them and are bringing Blacks into medical schools with qualifications that would be automatically disqualifying if presented by whites or Asians. It's really a cruel thing for anybody to be catapulted into an environment for which he's not competitively qualified. They don't do well. And this is the same thing if for gender preferences. If MIT admitted me with math SATs of 650 on an 800-point scale because they felt they needed more gender diversity in their engineering class because there weren't enough females there, as if I care about the sex of somebody that is building a bridge that I want to get across safely. All I care is that the best possible engineer for that job. But MIT has different ideas and thinks the gonads of engineers matter to their competence. So it admits me with 650 on an 800-point scale on math, and my peers who've been admitted based on merit, not gonads, all have 800s. I am going to struggle in my math classes in freshman year because I've been admitted to a peer group that is more academically qualified than I am. Now, I can still go to engineering school. I should go with students that also average 650, and my freshman calculus class and my freshman engineering and chemistry class will be pitched to my level of academic preparedness. But if I'm sent into MIT, it's frankly going to be hell on earth because I'm going to be behind, and lo and behold, what happens? The diversity bureaucrats show up and tell me, if you're feeling out of place, if you're struggling, if you're not doing as well as your peers, it's because you're in a rape culture. It's because you're in a patriarchy. It's because you are surrounded by a female hostile environment. They're not going to be honest and say, no, it's because you've been catapulted into an academic environment for which you are not competitively qualified. Now, the argument is always, but they'll do better. They'll catch up. They don't. It would be nice if they did, but they don't catch up. They struggle. It is cruel. It is an act of narcissism and ego on the part of these college administrators who only care about the photos that show up on their college website and making sure that they're suitably diverse, and do not care about the fate of Black students who have been admitted
More people of color are attending colleges and universities than ever before, but the graduation rate for Black and Hispanic men is far behind the general public.
Nobody, such as myself and other opponents of racial preferences, is saying Blacks shouldn't go to college. We are only saying Blacks should go to college on the same conditions as everybody else. They should go to colleges for which they are academically prepared and not catapulted into environments where they are set up with a handicap from the day they start school. That is cruel. It is thoughtless, and it is done simply for the egos of college administrators.
Blacks don't have the background and the money and the culture of many doctors in the family others have. It seems fair to give minorities a boost.
It's not fair to the alleged recipient of a racial preference because you are putting them into an environment where they are going to struggle. That is cruel. It is hard. You may have been an 800 math SAT, John, but if you were not, imagine.
That was my brother.
Okay, so you got all the critical thinking, and you just got the math wonkery. But would you want to be sent to MIT or Caltech without comparable skills to your peers?
I don't see the Black recipients of affirmative action complaining.
Well, that's a good point, because there is a networking capacity there. So one can ask whether that should dominate everything else. But the fact of the matter is, we have less Black doctors, we have less Black scientists because of racial preferences. There was a very good study that came from a Duke economist that found that Black male freshmen at Duke enter intending to major in a STEM field at a higher rate than white male freshmen at Duke intending to major in a science field. But by senior year, the science fields were practically exclusively dominated by whites and Asians because the Black males had been admitted with a standard deviation below in SAT scores, and they couldn't keep up. So they ended up transferring out of their intended STEM major into Black studies or anthropology or post-colonial studies. So yes, they're graduating maybe, but they are not graduating with the skills that they might have picked up had they been, instead of going to Duke with a standard deviation below of academic skills to your peers. What's wrong with going to a North Carolina university school? The elitism of this discourse is amazing. It's basically, if you don't go to Harvard, your life is over. Like all these Blacks, they'll never have a chance in life if they don't go to Harvard. Or I remember the chancellor of University of California, Berkeley, when the California voters, one of the few smart things they've done, passed a constitutional amendment saying there shall be no racial preferences in government, including in college admissions. And the chancellor of Berkeley said, well, where will we get the leaders of tomorrow? Meaning, you can't be a leader of California unless you go to Berkeley. Well, if that's the case, let's shut down University of California, Riverside. Let's shut down University of California, Los Angeles, and have everybody go to Berkeley, if that's the only way you can succeed. In fact, there are many ways to get an education.
I'm told the tests are racist.
They've been scoured for any question vaguely relating to a regatta for like 50 years. That was the idea, that these tests are based on this WASP cultural heritage.
My understanding actually is that Blacks did better on the regatta question.
Right. Well, the sports, I guess, I don't know, maybe they knew what to study for. But the fact of the matter is, if the tests were racist, they would underpredict Black achievement in school because they were not sufficiently measuring Black skills. And in fact, SATs overpredict Black college performance. So they're not racist. But yes, we have the Chicago Teachers Union head who recently said that these standardized tests are just another vestige of white supremacy and whites, racist obsession with excellence and objectivity and whatnot. The fact of the matter is SATs were created in order to overcome class bias that was favoring for the elite Ivy schools the graduates of prestigious prep schools in New England, the Andovers and Exeters and Choates and whatnot. We knew there was a lot of kids in the Midwest that didn't have access to those schools, but they had the academic skills to succeed, and that started breaking down what was actual class bias. So these tests have been examined and examined and examined. There is nothing better out there to predict college performance. The attack on merit, the attack on colorblind standards, the attack on high expectations of achievement is all being waged because we have this very troubling and very depressing, persistent academic skills gap on the one hand, meaning that, and this is something that's very difficult to talk about, and I need to give a trigger warning. It's something that well-meaning Americans turn their eyes away from. But the average skill level of Black students is very, very low. According to the most widely used, objective, respected measures of student competence, the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is given to hundreds of thousands of high school students and elementary school students every couple of years, 66% of Black 12th graders do not possess even the most basic 12th grade math skills. Blacks are way unprepared for college. They're way unprepared for graduate school, for medical school, for law school.
You've been called a racist repeatedly for saying stuff like this. And reasonably, people can say the only reason they're behind is because of the legacy of slavery. White people like us, we have capital, human capital, and actual capital many people have inherited. And no wonder Blacks are behind.
Well, there's two different issues there. Is it racist to notice the skills gap or the crime gap and to offer that gap as an alternative explanation for what is now the only allowable explanation for the fact that, for instance, Google does not have 13% Black engineers, or a cancer research lab does not have 13% Black oncologists working
13%
there.
being the percentage
of Blacks. The assumption is, our dominant assumption today is, if you have any institution that is not proportionally represented with Blacks, which is 13% of the population, the only allowable explanation is racism. There must be discrimination going on, that oncology lab or the Google engineering lab or AI lab is discriminating against competitively qualified Black engineers, Black nanophysicists, Black experts in Alzheimer's disease.
Maybe they are.
I proffer the skills gap as an alternative explanation. The fact of the matter is, given the degree of that skills gap, the average Black SAT score on math is 440 on an 800-point scale. The average combined Black SAT score is 907 on a 1,600-point scale. That is very low. That skills gap means that you can have meritocracy in an institution or you can have diversity. You cannot have both. Any institution that tells you that we are giving priority to diversity is telling you we have discarded meritocracy, because again, there are simply not enough competitively qualified Black applicants to go around to make those numbers match the proportion in the population. So that's one thing. Am I a racist for bringing this up? I am not. The facts are the facts. I don't care. The facts need to be looked at. They have been completely kept out of the public eye in order to keep this systemic lie of racism going on. Now, as far as what's the cause for that, that's a completely different discussion. But it does not have any bearing on whether right now there are institutions that are discriminating against qualified blacks. The opposite is the case. I talk to so many parents, Asian parents and white parents, that tell me, I've got this son. He had near perfect medical college admission tests. These are the standardized tests, the MCATs to get into medical school, or near perfect law school admissions tests, the LSATs. These are admissions tests to get into law school. Incredible GPA, record of doing, medical lab work as an undergraduate. My son didn't get into any medical schools because he is white and Asian and a male. This is very corrosive.
Boo-hoo. Those kids have money, they've had tutors, they have all the advantages.
They have the skills. I do not care, frankly, if they've had tutors. I want the best possible doctor. We don't have an oversupply of doctors. If you tried to get an opening appointment in a specialist recently, well, that'll be 9 months away. We clearly need more doctors. We are turning away the best applicants because they are the wrong race. We are not discriminating against black applicants. The University of California in San Francisco, it used to have about a third of its admitted medical school class was white. After the George Floyd race riots in 2020, the proportion of white students at UC San Francisco dropped to 15%, equal to the 15% of black students. Blacks are about 6% of the population in California. Their MCAT scores would be automatically, that are admitted to the University of California, San Francisco, would be almost automatically disqualifying if presented by a white applicant. And yet, there they are, equal. Now, of course, if they're qualified, open arms, but I can tell you, the reality of our world today is not white privilege, it's black privilege. That's just the simplest way to say it. I will believe that the reality is white privilege when I hear about a black college senior saying, how can I put my race down as white? Because that'll give me an admissions advantage to Harvard. In fact, Harvard, until recently, had about 16% blacks in its freshman class. If it admitted based on academic merit, there would be less than 1%.
And the class would be mostly Asian.
And Asians are being screwed.
Harvard University's admissions process discriminates against Asian American applicants.
They are being kept out. And this is a problem because we want to give people the incentive to succeed. And so far, what's been going on with Asians is we keep raising the bar.
A GPA was 4.42 weighted. SAT score was 1590.
Zhang was rejected by 16 of the 18 colleges he applied to.
I really thought, I had a good chance. And it turns out, however good of a chance I had, I didn't get in.
We say, okay, not enough to play two instruments, not enough to have perfect SATs, not enough to have perfect GPA. You also need to have discovered some new cellular process to get into Harvard. And then we say, not good enough, that we're going to raise the bar. And they keep meeting it. But at some point, they must just say, to hell with this. You want to be able to tell people that if you work hard, if you develop your skills to contribute to civilization, to be able to push back the boundaries of ignorance, which continue to hem around human progress, you will be rewarded, and you will not be jeopardized based on your skin color. That was the fact with blacks for most of our history. And now we've just turned around and we're doing the same thing with regards to whites and Asians. And you could say, well, turnaround is fair play, but it is not in anybody's interest.
I'm surprised you preceded this by saying trigger warning. Is that serious?
No, well, it's tongue-in-cheek, but people don't like to hear it. It traumatizes.
Trigger warnings were part of the leftist cult at colleges. Anytime somebody might be bothered by something, they said, I feel threatened, and therefore I don't want to hear it. I want to run away if I'm warned.
Well, let's be more precise.
Yes.
Trigger warnings were specifically demanded by females who now drive the academic culture. And they have been the biggest enemies of free speech on college campuses for decades now. They are the ones that claim to be so fragile that if they read Ovid's Metamorphoses, one of the great works of literature that is an absolute extraordinary vision of constant transformation, of a world that is in constant flux, where one form changes into another, where there's no stable knowledge, no stable reality. And Ovid was writing about the Greek myths, and in exquisite language, exquisite imagination. But in some of those myths, Jove and other males did abduct females. Okay, that was a literary conceit. But these females, who are the absolute king of the hill, that have had every privilege that has ever been available to females in history, they claim to be so delicate and vulnerable that they can't read Ovid because it will make them relive non-existent rape memories or something. And they're the ones that gave us the absolutely, we've learned now, lethal connections between non-orthodox speech is hate speech. And if you are a hater, and if you use hate speech must be suppressed because it is allegedly so dangerous and hurtful to marginalized groups. And females hilariously get to claim that they're marginalized, even though they're about like 2/3 of the student body at undergraduate levels, and the vast majority of these ridiculous administrators that do absolutely nothing. So dissenting speech, if you disagree with the theories about ubiquitous white supremacy or post-colonial hegemony in Israel or endemic sexism, you're a hater, your hate speech has to be canceled, and you're driven off campus. Here's another example of it. If I believe that my sex as a female is written into every cell of my body through the genetic code, and that there are two biological sexes as determined by the overwhelming majority of sex organs in males and females, and that the sex is not some whim that the obstetrician decides at birth, or just flip a coin, I'm going to assign you male or female. It's not that you've got a male organ there. It's just whim, and you can change it when you get older.
But that idea has been pushed back.
But that, too, was seen as a form of hate speech, and it wasn't pushed back by Tyler Robinson. Charlie Kirk, before he came to Utah Valley University, there was a student petition that went around saying he may not come to campus because he is a purveyor of hate and hate speech. And he will put us students at risk. We will be in danger because Charlie Kirk is going to step on campus and debate us because he's a hater. And this was the language that Tyler Robinson used in explaining his decision to assassinate Charlie Kirk because some forms of hate cannot be negotiated with.
President Trump says he's getting rid of affirmative action, DEI, so these problems are solved.
We're bringing meritocracy, the American way, back.
DEI at HUD is dead. It's gone.
Trump does have greater power over the federal bureaucracy for sure. So those claims may be true. It may be true that the official offices of diversity hiring in these agencies are now gone. Now, you still have a lot of personnel that believe deeply in the need for screwing white and Asians in the name of racial justice. But for now, it probably is the case that federal hiring is based on merit. That is less the case in the universities. I go between being optimistic and being pessimistic. If I'm in an unusually for me optimistic mode, I do think that having a presidential role model for 4 years, and maybe we'll get another 8 of somebody else who also is not cowed by the race hustle, that we will be able to really beat back racial double standards.
What do you mean race hustle?
Race hustle is a possibility of an entire industry played upon racial guilt. The idea that you can get whites basically to endlessly apologize for non-existent racism, that you can demand handouts, you can have quotas, you can have set-asides. We've seen this in government contracting for years, where firms are chosen not on the basis of their capacity to build a bridge, but based on the race or sex of their owners. The race hustle is the idea that you can get benefits and goodies by charging racism on absolutely fictitious grounds.
The Trump administration sending a letter to 9 prestigious colleges telling them to change course when it comes to things like deciding college admissions based on gender and race.
At first, it seemed like universities were a little bit worried by that, but now I see a lot of regrouping going on. All of these ridiculous offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which have no function at all. Like, please, none of your viewers should give any benefit of the doubt to these bureaucrats. There is no expertise behind it. To be a diversity bureaucrat does not mean you've got some specialized knowledge. No, there's no knowledge required to be a diversity bureaucrat. The only thing that's necessary is you're willing to prosecute the race hustle at the highest levels of the administration, and you're willing to lie through your teeth about the fact that you exist in a racist institution. So Trump said, no more federal money if you have a DEI office, or if you're penalizing highly qualified white and Asian students because of their skin color in admissions and hiring and promotions. So the universities, some of them did kind of dismantle the DEI offices, but a lot of the other ones just renamed them with some code words that were already circulating in use, but they've become even more popular now.
We had to change the names of some of our programs and stuff. Like we have queer brunch, we can't call it queer brunch anymore. You gotta call it cozy brunch.
Diversity and equity becomes belonging and community, but it's still about the same conceit that without a special cadre of bureaucrats, that these colleges are going to be filled with such hate and discrimination, and we need protection.
We're going to stop the destructive and divisive diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates.
You called Trump a role model. I have trouble with that. He's a crude, selfish bully, born to privilege, who's done some good things.
Born to privilege, I'm sorry, that doesn't...
That triggers you?
It leaves me completely unmoved. I don't care. I would agree with you on a lot of his personality, particularly as a male role model. He is a very poor one because he's vindictive, he's nasty, he lacks magnanimity. I was speaking exclusively to his courage in standing up to the race hustle. But, if we want to get into a Trump discussion here, it's a very, day by day, it's an increasingly complicated picture. One can admire and support his ends and be very uncomfortable with his means. And the usual Republican or conservative response when somebody points out that he is arguably abusing power, using his own lawfare, going after his enemies, sicking the power of the IRS or the Justice Department, interfering in the normal processes of neutral government. The usual response is, but the left's been doing that for decades. And they're right. It's hilarious. It makes me really, I both laugh and want to throw up when the universities complain that Trump is politicizing education.
The administration is intentionally creating confusion using diversionary tactics in order to make those who don't fit their agenda the enemy.
He's telling us we can't do unalloyed victim studies any longer. We have to have ideological balance, or we can't admit based on race and sex. He's politicizing education. Excuse me. You were the guys that said no conservatives allowed here in essence. I mean, that was the de facto rule. You're the ones that say if you want to give a speech on climate change, but in your off hours as an academic, you have written that universities should operate on merit, not on diversity, you will not be allowed to give your climate change speech at MIT because that is too against the orthodoxy. So universities have politicized themselves. Now they're claiming Trump is politicizing. That's ridiculous. So yes, the left got there first, but that doesn't mean it can't get worse. And that the precedent that Trump is setting for a very, very muscular, if not unconstitutional, use of executive power will come back to haunt conservatives.
One reason you're called the notorious white supremacist fascist is because you claim there are things called the Ferguson Effect.
The data shows that there is the Ferguson Effect. When you demonize police officers and say that they are the biggest threat facing blacks and that black parents should fear every time their child goes outside that he will be killed by a police officer, which was a favorite refrain of President Barack Obama and President Joe Biden, you demoralize those cops when you tell them that if they go to high crime neighborhoods and get descriptions from the victims of shootings as to who's doing the shootings and make arrests, they are racist because they're being brought into high crime neighborhoods based on crime data.
The post-George Floyd riots resulted in an excess of over 15,000 black male deaths in this country.
You're literally making a connection out of your own conjecture.
No,
you cannot.
It's
just
a real
do
thing.
that.
Look up the Ferguson Effect. Look up the Floyd Effect. It is a real term.
You cannot.
It's a real term. I didn't make this up.
Invent a connection between two things.
The media's in a bubble. They only hear what they want to hear. They only see what they want to see. It's like, mostly peaceful protests with the fires burning in the background. Same with like the ICE riots in Los Angeles. Oh, these were peaceful. No, you had people throwing cement blocks off of freeway overpasses on police, California Highway Patrol below. We all have our blinders. I'm sure I do too. We all have confirmation bias. We pick up what we want to believe and we ignore evidence that counteracts that, and we can excuse that away. So all of us have real epistemological limitations, and it's very hard to fight against, and it's not pleasant to be forced into debating your ideas. But the media has become really very ideologically monolithic. As a conservative, I can say I exist in a certain world of ideas, and we all feel familiar with those ideas, and it can be sobering to realize how little they penetrate outside of the conservative intellectual environment, or the libertarian one for that matter.
Few Americans know that, according to activists,
it's not just the cops that are racist, technology is racist.
ShotSpotter has been a failure.
The Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson wanted to get rid of a technology called ShotSpotter, which is just an acoustic device that picks up the sounds of shots so that when people are not calling in shootings, the officers can get there anyway and often save lives if they find somebody who's, in one case, a guy who was shot in a wheelchair. Nobody called in the shooting, but ShotSpotter picked it up and they were able to get him to the emergency room. But technology is racist because it shows that the vast, vast, vast majority of shootings happen in black neighborhoods. Black youth in Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston after the George Floyd race riots were shot at 100 times the rate of white youth. That's not the cops that is making that up. The cops can't help those numbers, but it means that the cops cannot go where people are most being shot without being overwhelmingly black neighborhoods. But if you tell the cops, as we did after the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, that turned into one of the biggest hoaxes, this was the hands up, don't shoot hoax. Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Michael Brown, a very burly teenager, had just stolen something from a store, and a police officer was called and tried to stop him. And we were told that Brown, in fleeing, had his hands up and said, "Hands up, don't shoot," and was shot, which was a complete lie. But this triggered months of rioting, not just in Ferguson. Hands up, don't shoot!
What was the truth?
The truth was that he'd been trying to grab the officer's gun and had put the officer at justified fear of his life. The Obama Justice Department, to its incredible dismay, looked into the narrative and found it was untrue. Nevertheless, Obama said, "Nevertheless, there still is cop racism." Let's not forget that. I paraphrase greatly.
Isn't there cop racism?
Not at all enough to worry about, frankly. I don't even want to talk about it because it is so minor an issue compared to what the real problem is facing blacks today. You could get rid of all police shootings of civilians tomorrow, and it would have virtually no effect on the black death by homicide rate. Blacks between the ages of 10 and 25 die of gun homicide at 25 times the rate of whites in that age category. And they're not being killed by the cops. They're being killed by other blacks. And nobody wants to talk about it. We're supposed to believe that we're all racist. It's the media that's racist. They don't give a damn about black lives. They don't give a damn about the dozens of blacks who are killed by homicide every single day. That's more than all white and Hispanic homicide victims combined, even though, as we said, blacks are 13% of the population. Virtually none of those black homicide victims gets covered. We are not saying their names because they're killed by other blacks, and we don't want to talk about that. So the Ferguson Effect says when you demonize the cops back off. And guess what happens? When the cops stop making stops, when they stop looking at hot spots where shootings have happened, and they back off, criminals get emboldened, and more black lives are taken. That's what happened after the Ferguson riots, after the George Floyd race riots in 2020. We had an even greater meltdown. We had every single American elite institution declaring it was racist to the core. And the cops were, of course, as usual, one of the main targets of this. 2020 saw the largest one-year increase in homicide in this nation's history, 29%, and thousands more black lives were taken. That's what happens when you demonize the cops. Is there room for better training? Of course, there's always room for better cop training, but you're not going to get that by shooting the messenger, which is what we're doing. Policing today is data-driven. One of the greatest government revolutions that you should support, John, began in the New York Police Department in the 1990s under Rudolph Giuliani and William Bratton. And it said government has to be accountable. We're going to measure outcomes, not inputs. We're going to hold precinct commanders ruthlessly accountable for crime in their precincts. And if they are not controlling it and lowering it, their job is on the line. Good intentions don't matter anymore. What matters is, are you performing? And we're going to measure that with data. So now, policing in New York and elsewhere is rigorously data-driven. They are monitoring on an hour-by-hour basis where shootings are happening, where robbery patterns are breaking out. They're going where 9/11 calls are calling them. They would prefer not to be told that it's another black-on-black shooting. When I started writing about the cops, I was in the 67th precinct in Brooklyn. And the cops there took me to the wanted poster wall for robberies. And the victims of these robberies, it's not the racist cops. The victims are overwhelmingly black. The wanted posters were exclusively of black criminals. And the cop said to me, we're not creating this world. This is the world as we receive it. What are we supposed to do? That's the problem, but we would rather talk about this fake epidemic of cop racism than be honest about the pathologies in inner city culture, in gang culture, that is leading to a rate of crime that is inconceivable. The black children that I've documented over the years who've been playing on trampolines, at barbecues, sleeping in their beds, at birthday parties, 1-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 9-year-olds, who are shot by stray bullets in drive-by shootings, who are killed, who are rendered brain damage for the rest of their lives. If white kids were killed at that rate, there would be a revolution. It's a very bizarre thing. We talk about racism all the time as an abstraction, and we claim that we care so much about black lives, but these black children that are getting gunned down, nobody talks about them. Above all, the media, above all, the Black Lives Matter activists. I have never, ever witnessed a Black Lives Matter rally to protest 3-year-old Honesty Cheadle. She was killed July 5th at a 4th of July barbecue in Washington, D.C. Drive-by shooting. Have we said her name? We're supposed to say the name of George Floyd. We're supposed to say the name of Michael Brown. Nobody said the name of Honesty Cheadle. Trump called in the National Guard. He said, this crime has got to end.
I'm announcing a historic action to rescue our nation's capital from crime, bloodshed, bedlam, and squalor, and worse. This is Liberation Day in D.C., and we're going to take our capital back.
I would say Trump was much more realistic and justified in saying that death is too many. This is a national emergency. And if it was white people, if it was white toddlers being gunned down in their beds or in their parents' cars, there would be a national emergency declared.
Well, this is why you're called racist, anti-black, capitalist, imperialist, fascist.
Well, they can call it all they want. I don't care. I take
You
those
really
as-
don't care all the heat you've taken?
I've had black people come up to me and say thank you. I've gone to black police community meetings in Harlem on the south side of Chicago. And what I hear those good people say is, we want more cops. Why aren't you getting the kids off the corners? Why don't you arrest for loitering any longer? Why don't you arrest for disorderly conduct? I'm scared to go down to my lobby because there's kids down there smoking weed, hanging out, selling drugs. The only time I feel safe is when the police are there. I've seen elderly black ladies stand up in these meetings and say, thank God for the police, they are my friends. So those are the people that I care about, not the ones that are living in a fantasy bubble of victimhood and hatred for the thing that they should be down on their knees in gratitude for.
What you call scientific policing, going where the crime is, does mean that black kids are stopped and frisked more often. My kids never got frisked. That's not fair. That's cruel.
Well, I remember when Giuliani was first starting his crusade to try and bring safety back to New York. There was a community activist in Brooklyn called Richard Green, and he said, between getting stopped and between getting shot, I'd rather be stopped. Now, if the cops are making stops without legal grounds, you know, there's a legal standard for this. It's called reasonable suspicion. The cop has to have reasonable grounds for believing that there may be criminal activity afoot. If the cop is simply pulling people over for no reason whatsoever, that's a problem. The fact of the matter is, given, again, I'm going to speak the truth here, and this is not pleasant for people to hear, but given the pervasiveness of crime within the Black community, 1 in 3 Black adults has a felony conviction. It is the case that as a law-abiding Black man,
Maybe they have a felony conviction because of racism, because they're more likely to be stopped, more likely to be prosecuted.
The police are going where the crime is happening. If there was that degree of crime going on in white neighborhoods, those parents would be calling the cops all the time. It's not as if cops have like all this extra time on their hands that, oh, let's just go hassle some Blacks. We've got nothing else to do. They are running from call to call. They are barely getting through that night's crime, and they're having to triage all the time. Prison remains a Lifetime Achievement Award for persistence in criminal offending. Most offenders are given community supervision, if they're prosecuted at all. Because what we have now, what we've had for the last decade at least, is massive decriminalization and deprosecution. Our prosecutors have decided that they're not going to prosecute crime because doing so has a disparate impact on Black criminals, not because the laws are racist, not because the prosecutors or the judges or the juries are racist or the police officers are racist. It's because there is an objective difference in crime commission. But if you don't take criminals off the streets, the result is more chaos in society. You have now, the preposterous situation that we've been living through since the George Floyd race riots of not being able to shop in a drugstore because everything is behind plexiglass. And so we're moving even more so online because we're not willing to arrest for shoplifting. Prosecutors are saying we're not going to prosecute shoplifting because that has a disparate impact on Black criminals. And so we've had these progressive prosecutors, whether it's Alvin Bragg in Manhattan or George Gascon in Los Angeles, who was voted out of office, or Pamela Price in Oakland, Alameda County, California, voted out of office, or Kim Fox in Chicago. All these people have said, we're not going to prosecute shoplifting, turnstile jumping, resisting arrest, which is really pernicious because it will have a disparate impact on Black criminals. So, in fact, we're not over-prosecuting, we're not over-policing, we are under-policing and under-prosecuting. The result of this is a society that does not govern itself, in which there's no security of property, there's no security of persons. We are refusing to put criminals in jail in New York City.
Resisting arrest would normally land you on Rikers Island, but not anymore. Just days on the job, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg is changing what crimes he will prosecute.
We need to reserve our justice system for real public safety challenges.
We live through this. The people that are committing assaults on subways, on the streets, have rap sheets that are endless. They've been picked up again and again and again. And the reason they're not going to prison is because doing so as a system will have a disparate impact on Black criminals. We've decided it's better not to incarcerate and to prosecute than to do so in a colorblind fashion if that has a disparate impact on Black criminals. The victims for that primarily are going to be Black themselves. The people that live in the inner city that have to live with these criminals who are not off the streets, but it affects all of us.
The story that got publicity was the pretty white Ukrainian woman.
A grisly stabbing in Charlotte, North Carolina, getting the White House attention. The victim is a Ukrainian refugee. The suspect is an ex-con.
DeCarlos Brown Jr. had 14 arrests. He was allowed on the streets again and again because the system had been changed. This happened a stabbing in the neck. The video is absolutely terrifying. This woman is scared out of her life. She doesn't know what's happened to her. She turns around and looks around. It's absolutely heartbreaking to see her vulnerability as she just sinks down as in a pool of blood. But Charlotte, where this stabbing in August happened, had a long history, at least since George Floyd race riots, if not before, of fighting for racial equity in the criminal justice system. They had trainings for the prosecutors. The police chief said, I'm going to cut back on discretionary arrests because policing, comes out of racism. The judicial system had, all these goals for racial equity, which means basically de-prosecuting, de-incarcerating. And so that was the environment in which DeCarlos Brown Jr. was operating. The entire system had now been set up to make it very hard to incarcerate any criminal. And he was the beneficiary of that.
And she was the victim.
And she was the victim. And frankly, that is the norm for interracial crime in this country. Another huge fiction, which is that this is a white supremacist country, and as Obama and Biden says, that blacks are right to fear for their children from racist cops or from white supremacists. As the mayor of Kansas City, Quentin Lucas, he has said, existing while black is another thing that blacks do to their lethal risk at this point. The fact of the matter is, the vast majority of interracial crime between blacks and whites on blacks is committed by blacks.
This is a horrible, highly publicized event, but you're a Manhattan Institute scholar. You're supposed to go by the data. What's the data?
The data is that the Charlotte stabbing was typical of interracial crime. The typical interracial crime is black on white, not white on black. A National Academy of Sciences report came out in 2023. The National Academy of Sciences is a left-wing, highly, it's the epitome of academic mindset outlook. One of the authors of this report was Bruce Western, a very left-wing academic at Columbia, and it found that blacks are 35 times more likely to commit an act of violence against a white person than a white person is to commit an act of violence against a black person. The Bureau of Justice Statistics finds that in the universe of interracial crime between blacks and whites, blacks commit, depending on the year, about 85%, sometimes a little less than that, of all interracial crime. So that's the reality. And of course, our narrative is just the opposite.
Because publicizing that doesn't make anybody feel good.
Right. And that's fine. I believe in racial etiquette. I would prefer not to have to talk about the skills gap. I would prefer not to have to talk about the crime gap. Nobody likes hearing these things, including whites. I mean, the people who feel worst about this is whites. So much for us being white supremacists. But the reason I have to bring these things up is because I'm living in a false narrative that is impugning our civilization, that is impugning our present society, that is tearing down standards in the name of fighting phantom racism. And so I have to speak the truth because I fear the consequences if this lie continues much longer.
Jumping to this, Karen Fleischman, an anti-racist educator, says your rhetoric divides people by race, which inevitably escalates to violence, making black people feel unsafe everywhere.
She's just throwing various terms, she's stringing them together. This was a woman who was brought in by Pamela Price, the Alameda County prosecutor. Alameda County is the county that Oakland sits in, which is across the San Francisco Bay from San Francisco, the East Bay from San Francisco. Pamela Price came into office vowing to bring racial equity to prosecution, meaning she had double standards for blacks and whites. To bring a prosecution against a black gang member, you had to have a much higher standard of evidence. She was going to discourage prosecutions against black criminals. And she had a workshop that was teaching her prosecutors how to deal with white victims on the theory that somehow white crime victims were a threat to black prosecutors. This gets back to this whole safety idea that we talked about in the universities, that somehow if you're marginalized, your safety is at risk in various American environments. Fleischman is this diversity trainer who goes around to police departments and also other workplaces. And it's the usual scam, that all you managers, you think you're colorblind, but you're really racist, and white people have to get up and do their white privilege walks and atone for their inherited endemic racism. I simply argued that this was an absurd waste of taxpayer money.
These types of trainings have also been given by private companies.
Diversity training where employees were told to be, quote, less white.
But there's been pushback against some companies' policies.
Harley-Davidson is the latest company to drop diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
I was gratified to see how quickly a lot of these CEOs junked their DEI functions.
But many kept.
Not all of them, that's absolutely right. The human resources departments there are staffed by the products of the university, overwhelmingly female, and they're not going to change their point of view. This is really a very long battle, and I think it's going to take more young white and Asian males saying we're not buying into the hustle. It's going to take more parents willing to stand up for their sons who are getting screwed at academic institution after academic institution. It's going to take more CEOs not to be browbeaten by their wives.
By their wives?
Females are overwhelmingly far more left-wing, and they push their husbands, their CEOs, I think, to buy into the entire gender
So
apparatus.
why is that?
Why are females more left-wing? I can't tell you, but it is absolutely the case.
And you say this has changed America.
The feminization of our institutions? Yes, it has.
Women are the problem?
Well, in certain numbers and in certain institutions, I would say they certainly change the ethic and the ethos of that institution. You can say for the better, or you can say for the worse. But do they change things? Absolutely. The change in the universities towards a victim identity, towards an attack on free speech, is absolutely parallel with the rise in female representation, above all in the administration, but in the student body and in vast swaths of the faculties as well. Poll after poll shows when you ask either people within academia or outside of academia, which do you value more, academic freedom and the pursuit of truth on the one hand, or equity and emotional safety and security on the other? There's no overlap. A vast majority of males choose the pursuit of truth, academic freedom, whatever the cost. The females favor emotional safety and equity.
Both are good qualities.
No, they're not in a university setting. The university exists for the pursuit of truth. And to be perfectly honest, the claims of unsafety, of danger, of jeopardy are completely hysterical neuroses in the first place. There's no safer environment as far as like just crime or rape than a university, but they're also exquisitely sensitive to people's feelings and are there as should be a community of scholars united by their passion to push back the boundaries of ignorance. The idea that they are unsafe or that one becomes unsafe, because here we get back to the hate speech conceit. The hate speech concept is related to this idea of emotional unsafety. For females to claim that they are emotionally unsafe on a college campus is complete fiction. It is just parading around in a little fake drama. I've never been discriminated against in my life. Now, does that mean, of course, I'm generalizing from a one case to many, but I would say that I am pretty representative, and I know that I have been put on panels or chosen for conferences for this and that because they need a female. Am I going to take deep offense at that? No, I'm not going to take offense at anything. But it's pretty ludicrous. And we had the head of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins, under Joe Biden, really an obnoxious man. He was all in favor of the lockdowns, of the insane COVID measures. He had called on his colleagues in the biomedical research world to boycott manels. And if you or your listeners don't know what a manel is a panel of experts, scientific experts or academic experts, that is predominantly male. Manels are verboten in Francis Collins's view. So he called on his colleagues to boycott any scientific conference that had a predominant number of males there.
Because that's the tradition. We men have dominated life, dominated so many institutions, making things, bring in female talent.
Only based on merit. I do not care to have a mediocre Alzheimer's researcher up there who is not going to be at the cutting edge based on her sex. I do not care.
And men achieve more in the sciences?
They have. Maybe they won't in the future, but right now we'll never know because we have double standards. Until Trump came along, your taxpayer dollars were being administered in the sciences not based on scientific merit, but based on race and sex. That is not relevant to scientific achievement. It has nothing to do with it. It is a waste of your taxpayer dollars. Taxpayers should demand that only the very best scientists, and I don't care if an Alzheimer's lab is all black or all Chinese or all female, if those are the best scientists. I don't care. And I also don't care if they're all white males, if those are the best scientists. So far, the history of science came out of Europe. It came out of this passion for discovery that began in the 17th century with the Royal Society in London, had its counterparts in France. It was a miracle. And you now have portraits of the greatest white male scientists being taken down from the Harvard Medical School, from the Pennsylvania Medical School, because it might make female medical students feel unsafe to look upon the greatest minds of medical science. If we disappear males from civilization, we will be living off the fumes of their accomplishments.
You're definitely striking a chord with some people, and that I noticed you did an interview with a very small, fine group, the Independent Institute, that doesn't normally get big attention, but you got 500,000 views on Twitter saying,
"It is not an accident. It is not a product of systemic misogyny that males brought us the scientific revolution, that they circumnavigated the globe. If we weren't so insane, it would be perfectly obvious that there are innate differences between males and females in terms of risk-taking, passion for novelty, competitiveness, aggression. You have to be a very ideologically dominated parent not to notice that there are differences between male and female children almost from the start, as far as levels of aggression, the types of toys that they gravitate towards. And males have a greater predilection towards insanity, towards like really stupid behavior. I hear these motorcycles trying to go 50 miles an hour down 2nd Avenue outside of my apartment in New York. I know what the sex of who's riding those, you idiots. Running red lights, massive amounts of alcohol, drug taking, fighting, dueling. These are all male traits. Females they're nurturers. That is, obviously I'm talking about the norm, the average.
You say it wasn't women who circumnavigated the world, but that was because their societies wouldn't allow it.
That's true, but they haven't been doing much in the interim, frankly.
If you women are so far behind us men, how come you have these high-level degrees from these fancy institutions, and I don't.
Because you got pulled into the grubbiness of doing journalism, which is you're involved in the world, you know? So, but I'm obviously playing both sides because I value academic degrees highly.
She has a bunch. She graduated from Yale and got advanced degrees from Cambridge and Stanford.
There's obviously exceptions, individual exceptions. There's highly aggressive, competitive females. And highly nurturing, empathetic males. Of course.
Taking a step back from their own careers to care for their families.
But we're talking about averages. And the average male, there's a greater chance that he's going to be a risk taker and a seeker of knowledge. And I can prove this by what I collect of natural experiments that don't have gatekeepers, because the usual feminist argument is, oh, there's no 50-50 representation in cancer research or chess champions because there's all these racist, sexist gatekeepers keeping females out. So it's not an even playing field. But we have institutions without any gatekeepers that allow us to see what are the natural predilections of populations on their own. What did they do on their own without anybody keeping them out? And the perfect example for that, but there's others, is Wikipedia editing. Wikipedia is a new institution.
Wikipedia is obviously highly biased. The majority are 87% male.
You can say in chess, the argument is, well, we've had, virtually no, maybe one female chess master at the highest level in hundreds and hundreds of years. There's this centuries-long tradition of discrimination against females in chess. So if you start out, if you're a young Bulgarian girl now, you're just not going to try because somehow you're aware that in the 17th century, females were not attended to enough. It's like some inherited, acquired characteristic. But Wikipedia is 30 years old? There's no long-standing sexist Wikipedia tradition. It grew out of nothing. And anybody can be an editor. It's blind. Anybody can be an editor. There's not a crew of sexist Wikipedia gatekeepers saying, it's a female. We're not going to allow her to revise this entry on Napoleon's invasion of Egypt or the deciphering of the Rosetta Stone. We're not going to allow females to edit that, but they can't because you don't know who they are. You do not give your sex in being an editor. Anybody can do it. And guess what? Who is the vast, vast majority of Wikipedia editors? Males. Nobody's keeping females out. They just aren't interested. And don't give me a Wikipedia tradition against females because there are no traditions. You can also look who is writing letters to the editor. Nobody is preventing females from writing letters to the editor. Skews way male. Who subscribes to journals of public interest, of world affairs, The Economist, The Atlantic, The New Republic? Nobody prevents females from subscribing to those journals. The readership is overwhelmingly male. Why? Because males are more outer-oriented, they're more data-oriented. This again got James Damore fired from Google by saying that males care more about data, females have different interests.
Years ago, I did a 2020 special, Boys and Girls, Men and Women, the Sex Difference, pointing out there are real differences.
Tonight, a touchy subject. To some people, even suggesting there are differences between the sexes, beyond the obvious ones, is just unacceptable. A step backwards in the hard-fought battle for equality.
One of my fellow correspondents backed the producer into the bathroom at 2020. How could you work with John Stossel on that video, she said. How could you say those things?
Prove us wrong. Prove us wrong. I love this. All the pictures in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal of these AI startups. It's like hot. San Francisco's hot. I was just there, like every billboard is AI. These sort of runic phrases that I have no idea what they mean, but they're all males. And nobody's preventing females from doing an AI startup. And nobody's stripping females of venture capital funding, as we saw with the fraudster Elizabeth Holmes, who had, George Shultz and everybody else under the sun shoveling billions of dollars at her. Everybody wants there to be more female entrepreneurs in whether it's biomedicine or whatnot. But they don't have that same drive to stay up till 3 a.m. eating cold pizzas, coding. They, as James Damore said, they have other alternatives. There's many explanations. Females tend to have maybe both the strongest math. Females also have verbal skills, so they have greater options. But frankly, that drive to conquer facts and data is disproportionately male.
I bought this strange Zara dress.
I'm trying on 6 spring dresses at Kohl's.
Hey guys, I have another really big shopping haul.
What do I see females doing these days? They're influencers.
I love to use a really fluffy brush.
They're talking about makeup.
These are the colors. They're so pretty.
They're talking about fashion.
Okay, let's talk about this lace leather skirt.
Google is desperate to hire more females. Caltech is desperate for more female engineers. I was asked at one point to do a panel on Fox Nation on interest rates. And I said, you're just asking me because I'm a female, right? Because I don't know monetary policy. And at least they had the honesty to say yes. Female privilege exists. There's not a mainstream institution that isn't overrepresented in females, and they're still going to say we need more females. It's incredible. They're not going to stop until there's no males left.
Women are inferior, you're saying? Less useful for society?
They are very useful for raising children. As individuals, they are very useful in terms of their consciousness. Every individual is useful. Again, I mentioned George Eliot before, one of the great novelists, Edith Wharton, one of the great novelists, Insights. We've got some great female composers, Fanny Mendelssohn, Cécile Licard. I want to hear all of them, absolutely. But I am not going to try to tear down an institution because it is predominantly male.
Men drove the 30 Years' War. Men drove the 100 Years' War. Women aren't responsible for the endless Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Maybe it would be better if women managed governments.
Well, we're seeing that in Europe. They're managing governments, and we've got these insane green energy policies that are the very epitome of irrationality now. Europe is in the doldrums economically, in large part because of the war on its energy sources. So males have war, but balanced against that, you have 1,500 years of extraordinary success in vanquishing disease, poverty, want. Our standard of living today, it's a miracle. Everything around us, every piece of furniture, hot water, showers, clean milk, clean water, these are all miracles. We won't even talk about flight. We won't even talk about telephones. It's extraordinary. Our existence bears no resemblance to even being in the aristocracy in the 19th century.
But as we've made progress now and things are much better, at the same time, it happened as women got more power.
Women got power in the 20th century. The progress that brought us into scientific dominance, I think, began much before that. We had these European wars, but we've also developed the nation state that minimized tribal warfare. We developed ideas of constitutional government, of due process, of human rights. Those are much more powerful than the 30 Years' War. Yes, there's still incredible barbarism in the Middle East And there's endless savagery in Africa between tribes that have not yet really absorbed the concept of a constitutionally controlled national government.
Violence driven by men.
By men, that's right. But I don't see what the alternative is. Most people prefer to be managed by males, not females, because of the vindictiveness that they feel is often shown, and this is females that feel this as well, by female managers. So it's interesting because when feminism was sort of first becoming quite presumptuous in the 60s and 70s, the war argument was used a lot, that
the world would be better, safer if women
ruled the world.
Women and children have long paid the price for wars, started and waged by men.
Women leaders must step up.
Women want peace.
And that hasn't really proved to be the case. It's very curious. Some of these, the Green parties, the female-dominated parties in Europe, some critics think that they're the war parties. They're all for continuing to arm Ukraine, and there's some people that are skeptical of that, or they were all for the involvement in the Serbian conflict. So it's curious. A lot of the female EU politicians are no more pacifistic than some of their male colleagues.
MacDonald has written many controversial books. The Burden of Bad Ideas.
The Burden of Bad Ideas was a collection of essays that looked at the rise of the welfare state. The New York Times, since the early 20th century, has done an annual Christmas charity appeal that used to be called the 100 Neediest Cases. And it was started by Albert Ochs, so it's the whole start of the Times legacy family. And they started publishing profiles of what they viewed as the needy members of New York City and ask readers to please give donations to help these people. And they had, at that time, what was the ubiquitous understanding of poverty and need, which was based on a distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. And they were unapologetic about this. Examples of the deserving poor, people that you should give your charity to, are the widows of people that have husbands, workers that died in industrial accidents, or orphans who were orphaned because their parents both died of tuberculosis. And now you have a 14-year-old sister who's doing seamstress work to try and help her younger siblings survive. They are working, they are trying to better themselves. The undeserving poor are the alcoholics, the vagrants that are begging, that are demanding handouts without trying to help themselves. And I went into the archives and looked at, decade by decade, how the Times was making its 100 Neediest Cases appeal. And what was remarkable, as you got into the 1940s and 1950s, the rhetoric started changing, and those bright line distinctions, which were used by FDR, he opposed giving welfare benefits to single mothers. He said this is going to be very corrosive of the most important pillar of civilization and personal responsibility, which is the married two-parent family. We shouldn't be rewarding single mothers unless they're widows with benefits. FDR, who gave us a vast expansion of the welfare state, nevertheless maintained that distinction between those who are trying to help themselves and those who are not. The Legal Aid Society, now like one of the biggest advocates for no strings attached welfare, when they started out offering legal services to the poor, they said, I don't care if you have no money, you're going to pay us a quarter for services, because anything that we give out for free will be devalued. We want this to be a fair transaction so that you feel like you're offering something and you're getting something back. We don't want things that are just handouts with nothing asked of the recipient in return. But in the 40s and 50s, you got a new mentality coming up as manifested in the 180 cases appeals. You had the rise of the whole juvenile delinquency. You know, we can't expect teenagers to behave and follow the law because they've been raised by parents that don't understand them. You know, they're just like alienated and they need psychiatrists to help them. And then in the 60s, you had welfare rights coming up, and the Times totally discarded the distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor and started writing about these single mothers that have been on welfare for decades and have had many children by many different fathers, and they became the target of the charity appeal. And so this was a unwitting documentation of the revolution in thinking in the 20th century that was so profound, that is something that you've talked about, John, of the assumption of a dependent class of which nothing should be asked in return, whose solution to poverty is allegedly unconditional transfer payments, redistribution of wealth from the so-called wealthy to the poor. That's what's going to help people, when that's not. What's going to help them is the expectation of self-reliance.
And what harm did that do, giving them money? How did that change the culture?
It destroyed the ethic of self-reliance and independence. Being responsible for yourself. If you don't have something, you work for it. You don't expect that the government owes you a living for doing nothing. The welfare rights revolution, which began with two academics, Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven, they wanted to destroy any stigma attached to welfare. They said, this is very bad.
Stigma's cruel.
There's people that are not collecting food stamps because they don't want the stigma. And they said, we should just get rid of this, and people should feel, I'm entitled to this. I'm not going to feel apologetic. Stigma is necessary to maintain certain positive social behaviors. Society has to have some way, short of like criminal penalties, of trying to create incentives for behavior that is going to help the individual. And hooking up to the welfare system as early as possible for as much as you can get is cruel, because that person is never going to learn to be able to support himself, to realize his own capacities that can only come about by challenge, by learning, by having to deal with setback and moving towards something where you feel like you're responsible for yourself and not the entitlement mentality. Right now, we have this problem of all these able-bodied males that are sitting around collecting Medicaid. They watch over 4 hours of TV a day. This has been done by Time studies. They spend 2 hours socializing and entertaining themselves otherwise beyond TV. And they're not working. They're able-bodied and they're collecting Medicaid. That's a problem. That's a lot of human talent that is sitting there fallow.
It's the incentives. Before welfare, Americans were lifting themselves out of poverty every year. The poverty level was dropping a bit, but the progress was slow. Welfare helped a lot. Poverty line dropped, but then progress stopped. For the first time in history, there was a dependent class that stayed dependent.
Well, I'd like to map that with the out-of-wedlock birth rate and look at family formation, because basically in the United States today, poverty is just a synonym for single motherhood. There are very, very few married couples that count as poor. It is very hard to raise children with two parents. If you only want to think of it in terms of finances, which I think is like the least relevant thing for raising children, what's much more important is the emotional support, the fact that males and females on average bring different psychological skills and approaches to children. But if you just want to talk about money, you've got more resources. You've got twice the kinship resources to draw upon. You have either one possible income or two to raise that child. So poverty today is really all about the breakdown of the American family.
Why did that happen?
Possibly because of welfare saying, okay, we're no longer going to expect you to be married. You can be single and we're going to give you the benefits. But it's also, I think, there's a lot of things that were going on. There was also feminism, which devalued males, basically said that, males are an afterthought. They can maybe come into the family, but they don't have to. Strong women can do it all. The concept of American poverty is sort of a fiction. You go up to 125th Street in Lexington, you walk out into a sea of fast food detritus that people have just dropped there. If you're buying fast food, you're not poor. You could eat much more cheaply by cooking for yourself. So it's very, very relative, our concept of poverty today. The real poverty is a poverty of values that has been embedded by the growth of the welfare state, and it's also been embedded by the fact that we are no longer willing to speak up for the values that I think human society does need to stay on a path that will allow more individuals to really realize themselves. And also, I just think, to get back to the Western civilization point, knowledge is an end in itself. And to appreciate what Western civilization has done with the beauty of the scientific method, with this insatiable curiosity that members of the West have had, that Europeans had, to figure out planetary motion, navigate the globe, figure out geology, figure out physiology. It's an extraordinary thing. And we're all beneficiaries of that, ignorant beneficiaries of that. I couldn't possibly replicate any part of the knowledge that has given me everything that I take for granted. And we shouldn't be ingrates. We should be grateful and know our history and know how much we should be so thankful for what we've got.
Thank you, Heather MacDonald.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for watching this longer than usual conversation. If you want to help us bring you more extended interviews, click that button.